The air reaches you first, warm and green and alive with something you can't quite name. The trees here are dense, the light filtered gold through 1,000 moving leaves. Somewhere close you hear it, a low, wandering melody drifting through the undergrowth, unhurried, half wild. The forest around you is Arcadia. His name is Pan. He was born in Arcadia, though the exact hillside has been forgotten. The mountain daughter of Dryops carried him through her labor in the hours before dawn. The light was grey. The trees were cold. There was no one near her but the sounds of the forest. And even those seemed to hold themselves still as the birth neared its end. The infant came into the world with goat legs already folded beneath him. Small horns curved from his brow. His face was broad and dark-haired, and his beard, thin as it was already there. His eyes were wide and animal bright. He opened his mouth and made a sound that was not quite crying. His mother looked at him once. She did not look again. She stood, and she walked away from him down the mountainside, and she did not stop walking. The infant lay in the cold grass. The sound he made carried through the trees and down toward the valley. No one heard it but the birds, who had already returned to their branches and begun again their morning noise. It was Hermes who came. He had always had a fondness for unexpected children. He moved quickly through the trees, his steps precise even on uneven ground, and when he reached the infant on the cold hillside, he stopped and looked down for a long moment. The child looked back at him. The child did not cry. That was the first remarkable thing about Pan. He had been abandoned in the cold before daybreak on a steep mountainside, and he did not cry. He looked at the god who had fathered him with those wide, bright eyes, and he made only that low, wandering sound, half voice and half something else. Hermes crouched beside him. He touched the small horns lightly with one finger. He touched the goat legs, folded and warm. He felt the soft, dark hair of the infant's head. Then he laughed. It was not unkind. It was simple delight, the laugh of a god who has just understood a joke told entirely in living flesh. He unwrapped a bundle of hareskins he carried at his side. He had brought them as if he knew. He wrapped the infant carefully, the soft skins folding around the small goat legs and the curved horns and the broad little face. He lifted the bundle against his chest. The child made that sound again, low, wandering, unhurried. Hermes stood. He looked out across the Arcadian hills in the early light. The trees ran down the slope in every direction. The valley below was still dark. The sky above was turning the pale colour it turns just before gold arrives. He began to walk upward. Not toward another valley in Arcadia, not toward the river or the caves below. He walked upward toward Olympus, carrying the strange hareskin bundle against his chest, and the child rode in his arms quietly, watching the world pass with those bright, unhurried eyes. Olympus, when they reached it, was already loud with the morning business of gods. Light fell across the marble without shadow. The air there was different, clean, in the way that air above weather is clean, thin, and permanent. Hermes set the bundle down in the gathered company of gods. The hareskins fell open. Pan looked up at the assembled Olympians with the same expression he had worn on the cold mountainside. Curious, and afraid. For a moment no one spoke. Then the laughter began, not the laughter of cruelty, but the laughter of pure, uncomplicated joy. The gods leaned forward, and they looked and they laughed, the way beings laugh when they see something genuinely, unexpectedly alive. Even those who rarely smiled found themselves smiling. Even the solemn ones, even the proud ones. Zeus looked at the infant for a long time. He said a single word. At all. It was not a consolation. It was a recognition. Something in the child's broad face and bright eyes and goat legs and half-wild sound was all of it, all of the world that was not palace and throne and law. The untamed part. The part that moved before thought. The infant received the name without ceremony. He lay on the floor of Olympus among the warm light and the sound of divine laughter, and he made his sound again. And the gods listened, and something in the sound pleased them deeply. But Arcadia was always where he would return, the high country, the dense forest, the dark soil and the resin smell and the stone. It called to him even in that first hour on Olympus, in the way that the place a creature is born calls to it across every distance. He had been abandoned on a cold hillside and named by a king of gods and wrapped in hare-skins and carried to the peak of the world. He had delighted every immortal who saw him. And still it was the slope where he began that would shape everything that followed. The belonging was real. The laughter on Olympus was real, and the longing for the wild was also real, and it would not diminish. He would carry both of those things his whole life, the delight of the gods and the darkness of the hill before dawn. The moss here is still soft. The melody has gone quiet for a moment. The trees hold perfectly still. The hare-skins lay folded somewhere on the floor of Olympus, their work already done. These stories are free, and always will be, but if they bring you peace, a subscribe helps more find their way here. Pan grew up on stone and moss. He did not stay on Olympus long. He was too loud for it, or perhaps Olympus was too quiet for him, not in sound, but in texture. The marble was smooth and permanent. The light fell without interruption. There was nothing to climb, nothing to root through, no soil that smelled of last night's rain. He came back to Arcadia before he had words for why. The hills received him without ceremony. The trees did not lean back from him. The goats on the upper slopes did not scatter. He moved through the forest as a young god moves through the place that made him, with his whole body unhurried. Pressing through the undergrowth without forcing it, feeling the give and resistance of each branch, his goat legs carried him easily on steep ground. That was one of the first things he learned about himself. Where a mortal would slow and lean and place each foot with caution, he moved upward without thought. The loose shale of the higher ridges, the wet clay near streams, the soft rot of fallen pine, he read all of it through the soles of his hooves before his eyes caught up. He spent his first long years learning the country, not as a god claims territory, no announcement, no dominion declared. He simply walked it until he knew it. The eastern slopes where the oak grew denser and darker. The open ridgelines where the wind came through cold even in high summer. The deep valleys where the streams pooled above rock and the water was so clear you could see the pale shapes of stones on the bottom from 10 paces away. He knew where the wolves moved at dusk. He knew which caves held cold air in their deepest chambers and which held only darkness. He knew the shepherds who camped in the high pastures through the warm months, moving their flocks between the sparse upper grass and the richer meadows below. He watched the shepherds for a long time before he approached them. They were careful men. Quiet men, the way men become who spend most of their days in high places, with no company but animals and sky. They slept lightly and woke at small sounds. They knew the difference between a fox moving through the brush and something larger. They did not frighten easily. But they had not seen anything like Pan before. The first time he stepped into a shepherd's firelight, the man went still. His hand moved toward the staff resting at his knee. His eyes moved over Pan's horns, his legs, his broad face, and the dark beard that had been there since his first morning. He did not run, but he did not speak either. Pan sat down across the fire from him. He did not explain himself. He did not ask for anything. He only sat, and after a time the shepherd's hand moved away from the staff, and the sheep on the hillside settled back into their grazing sounds, and the fire between them burned lower in the ordinary way. That was how it went with most of the shepherds. Not friendship exactly, not at first, more like mutual recognition. Two things that lived on these hills, acknowledging each other. In time they came to know what his presence meant. The flocks were calmer when he was near. Wolves kept their distance. The strange, sudden losses that troubled other men's herds did not happen on the hillsides Pan frequented. Milk did not sour. The grass on the high meadows seemed to hold its green longer than it should. He did not plan any of this. He was simply present, and his presence had weight. The nymphs of Arcadia were less easy than the shepherds. They moved through the forest in groups of 2 and 3, light on the ground, their laughter reaching him before they did. They knew these hills as well as he did, but they did not stay still when he came near. They shifted, like birds before a change in weather, not fleeing, not yet, but reorganizing their distance. He noticed this. He noticed it in the way he noticed everything about the landscape, not with hurt, but with observation. They were part of the country he was learning. Their unease was part of its texture. There was one in particular he remembered from those first years. She moved along the upper streams, following water through the forest with a lightness that made even his own sure-footed movement seem heavy by comparison. Her name he did not yet know. He watched her the way he watched the wolves, with attention, with patience, without closing the distance. He would learn later that closeness was something he had to approach carefully, that the same quality in him that pleased the gods on Olympus, that rawness, that animal brightness, could tip differently in a creature that stood closer to the ground. He did not know it then. He was young, and the forest was large, and every morning brought new ground to cover. The days on Arcadia had a shape to them. Dawn came grey and cool through the pines. He moved in the early hours, covering ground, checking on the scattered flocks. Midday arrived and the light changed. A specific stillness settled across the hillsides, heavy, golden, complete. He rested then in whatever shade was nearest. The wilderness around him held its breath. He noticed that mortals did not like this hour. They hurried through it or avoided the open hillsides altogether. Something in the midday silence unsettled them, made them hear things that were not there, made them walk faster than they had intended, made them feel that the trees were closer together than before. He did not fully understand this yet. He would, in time. In the late afternoon the light softened and the movement began again. Goats came down from the upper rocks. Birds shifted in the canopy. The stream below the tree line, audible all day as a faint threading sound, seemed to rise slightly in the cooling air. He was most himself at dusk, standing on a high place above the valley, the last light going out of the sky, the darkness coming up from below rather than down from above. The smell of pine resin and turned earth, his own breath. The small sounds of the country settling into night. He carried the memory of Olympus with him through all of it. The laughter, the warmth of the gods who had leaned forward to see him. Zeus's single word. But standing on the ridge at dusk with the valley darkening below, Olympus was very far away. This was the ground that made him, the cold grass of his first morning. The stone, the dark soil and the resin and the moss still soft underfoot, and the sound of the forest which he had been making since before he had a name for it. The midday hour, over time, became the thing he understood best about himself. It arrived the same way every day. The light thickened. The shadows pulled back under the trees and stayed there. The birds went quiet, not gradually but all at once, as if something had passed a hand across the canopy. The grasses on the open hillsides stood very still. And the mortals felt it. That was the part he came to understand slowly through seasons of watching. A shepherd crossing an open meadow at noon would pause. His step would shorten. His eyes would move to the tree line without his choosing to look there. Some quality in the air reached into him and turned something, not quite fear, but the animal precursor to it. The thing that lived below thought, below name. Pan would be resting in the shade of a boulder or stretched across a shelf of rock. He was not doing anything, he was simply present. And his presence, at that hour, in that silence, was enough. He did not yet know what to call this. He only knew that the stillness belonged to him, and that something passed between him and any mortal who entered it, some wordless communication. Some knowledge transferred without language, travelling through the thick noon air like heat from the stone. The Greeks had a word for it later. Panic. It came from his name, which meant all. He would think about that in later years, the word that mortals made from him. They had taken the feeling, that sudden, reasonless dread, that urge to run without knowing from what, and traced it back to its source, to the god who rested at midday on Arcadian hills, to the animal bright thing that sat at the centre of the wild world's silence and simply breathed. He was not proud of it exactly, but he was not ashamed of it either. It was simply true. Part of the territory of what he was. He did not cause it deliberately. Not then, in those early years. It arose the way his presence in the flocks arose, not through intention, but through nature. He was what the noon hour was. The same quality that made the goats calm on his hillsides made the lonely traveller's blood move faster. Both responses came from the same root. The mortals who came to know him well, the older shepherds, the ones who had sat across his fire a dozen times, did not feel it in the same way. Familiarity changed the signal. They knew the shape of what they were feeling and could set it aside. But a stranger crossing the open hillsides at noon, unfamiliar with these particular high meadows, might suddenly find his feet moving before his mind had decided anything at all. Pan watched this happen and filed it away. He was learning what he was, the way anyone learns anything, by watching his effect on the world around him. The caves of Arcadia became his during this time. There were dozens of them. Shallow ones pressed into limestone cliffs above the tree line, deeper ones that went back into the dark beyond the reach of light, where the sound of water ran through stone walls and the air stayed cold through the full heat of summer. He moved between them with the same ease. He moved across the hillsides. They were part of the same country. He slept in them. He sheltered in them through the worst storms, listening to rain cross the mountains in heavy curtains, the thunder arriving long after the lightning because the valley walls caught and held the sound and passed it back. The caves held old things. Offerings, sometimes, left by hands he had not seen. Small clay figures set at the back of the dark. A handful of dried herbs laid across a flat stone. Oil in a shallow bowl, long since evaporated, leaving only the ring of its residue. Mortals had been coming to these caves before he arrived, long before. The hillsides of Arcadia remembered older gods, or older versions of what gods were, forces with no names yet. No stories, only presence felt in the dark of a hillside cavity where the stone breathed cold air. He was continuous with that. He understood this without needing to think it through. Whatever those older presences had been, they had left something in the ground, in the stone, in the dense air of the cave interiors. He had grown out of the same soil. The pine trees knew it. Their roots went down through the thin mountain earth and into the rock itself, and the rock remembered everything. He had noticed the pines early. They were different from the other trees. Steadier. They held their needles through the cold months when the oak and beech went bare. They smelled the same in rain as in dry heat. They lined the ridge lines and the upper slopes like sentinels, neither welcoming nor turning away, simply there. He felt comfortable among them. Something in their permanence suited him. The way they kept their green when the season turned, and the lower forests went to rust and yellow. The high meadows would go brown and dry under the late summer sun, and the pines above would stand unchanged, their scent deepening as the air cooled. He wore pine sometimes. A wreath of it, the needles still attached to the cup branch, the resin still wet where the stem broke. He could not have said why exactly, only that it felt right, that the smell of pine resin belonged on him, the way the hills belonged under his hooves. The seasons were turning already in those first years, though he did not feel the urgency in them yet. He watched the high meadows go through their changes, the late rains of autumn softening the ground, the first cold mornings when the grass held ice in the low places and his breath came out in small clouds, the deep silence of winter on the upper slopes where snow lay in the shadows of the rocks for weeks. Only the wind moving, and below the tree line the goats standing together in the warmth of each other. Then the slow return. The ground remembering softness. New grass finding its way through the pale residue of winter. The streams running high and fast with meltwater, filling the valley with a sound fuller than the summer threading. The nymphs returning to the upper courses. He covered the same ground, season after season, the same ridgelines, the same caves, the same sheep paths down from the high meadows to the lower water. Each circuit of the year left him slightly different, not visibly, but something accumulated, some understanding that could not be put into words, only carried. He was god of this, he knew that much. God of the flock, the hillside, the cave, the stone, the noon hour with its freighted silence. God of the small presences in the dark at the back of the cave, and of the fox slipping through the brush at dawn, and of the goat bell carrying across the valley on still air. God of panic, too. Of the irrational fear that the open country could generate without warning. He held that as well. He did not rule these things. He was not separate from them, managing from a distance. He was inside them. The midday silence was his breath. The cold of the high cave was his cold. The pine scent on the ridge was something that moved through him and out of him both at once. That was the difference between Pan and the gods who sat above clouds. Olympus looked down. He looked across, at the same level as the moss and the stone and the slow-moving water in the shallow pools between rocks, where the light made patterns that shifted as the sun moved. And the patterns were not a message, only a fact of how light moved across water. He rested in a cave as the afternoon turned long and the shadows stretched across the valley below. Outside, a breeze came through the pines. The needles made their particular sound. Just above hearing, just at its edge. He listened. The breeze moved through the pines and then was gone. Pan stayed where he was. The cave mouth framed a portion of the sky, pale blue, edged with a dark silhouette of needles. A single cloud moved through the frame and past it. Then only sky again. He had been still long enough that a lizard had come out onto the rock beside him. Small, grey-brown. It sat with its sides moving, warming itself, indifferent to his presence or unaware of it. He watched the lizard. The lizard watched the air. Then he heard something. Not the pines, not the distant water threading through the lower stones. Something lighter, a sound that moved the way laughter moves, briefly, without intending to be heard, gone before it could be fixed. Pan lifted his head. The sound came from somewhere along the upper ridge. Among the pines, where the slope levelled briefly before rising again toward bare rock, he could not see the source. The trees were dense there, and the light came through them in pieces, breaking apart against the ground in shapes that shifted when the upper branches moved. He did not move immediately. He only listened. The sound came again. Lighter still this time, or perhaps farther. It was difficult to say. The ridge had ways of bending sound back on itself, sending it around the curve of the hillside, so that a thing heard twice might have only happened once. But this had happened twice. He was certain of that. He rose from the cave mouth without hurrying. His hooves found the familiar ground, the thin soil over stone, the dry grass at the cave's edge, the bare rock where the slope turned steeper. He moved upward along the ridge path without thinking about his feet. He had walked this path in darkness. He knew every place where the stone turned slick, every root crossing the track. The pines closed around him as he climbed. Their scent was stronger here, higher up, where the air moved less. Resin and cold stone, and the particular dry smell of pine needles lying deep over the ground, breaking down slowly over years into something almost sweet. His own wreath carried the same smell. He noticed it again as he moved into the denser shade. The light thinned. Shadows layered over each other beneath the trees. He slowed. There, among the upper pines, where two large trunks grew close together and a fall of old needles lay thick between them, something moved, light on its feet. Quick, there and then behind a trunk and gone. Pan stood still, a nymph, moving through the pines with the ease of one who belonged to them entirely. Not the water nymphs he knew from the stream courses below. Those moved differently, with the looseness of things that lived in current. This one moved the way the pine-covered hillside itself moved when the wind crossed it, light, rooted in motion. She did not see him, or if she did, she gave no sign. She passed between the trees, touching one as she went, a brief contact, palm to bark, as if greeting it. Her laughter, when it came again, was low, directed at nothing in particular. At the afternoon, perhaps, at some private observation about the light or the sound of the wind through the high branches above. Pan had no name for her yet. He watched her move. The pine needles made almost no sound under her feet. She passed through a bar of light that fell between the trees, and for a moment her outline was sharp against it. And then she stepped back into shadow, and the shape softened again. She moved deeper into the pines. He did not follow. He was not sure why. He could have followed. The ground was familiar. He would have made no more sound than she did. But something held him at the edge of the clearing, watching the space where she had been. The pines stood as they always stood, patient and dark and smelling of themselves. Later he would understand this moment differently, much later. The way you understand the beginning of a thing only from the far side of its ending. He would know then what he did not know, standing on that ridge, that the nymphs of this high country had a way of becoming fixed. That something about Arcadia, about the stone and the root and the accumulated presence of the old forces in the soil, could receive a living thing and hold it, change its form but not release it. He did not know this yet. He stood at the edge of the pines for a while. The light was beginning to angle, mid-afternoon, the shadows lengthening toward the eastern slopes. Somewhere below a goat bell rang once and stopped. The sound she had made, that low private laughter, stayed with him in a way other sounds did not. The valley had given him back many sounds over the years. The thunder, the goat bells, his own pipes sometimes, when he played near the curved face of the rock above the lower meadow, and the music came back to him changed. Slightly lower, slightly slower, like an answer from somewhere that understood the question differently. Her laughter did not come back. It had moved into the pines and stayed there, or it had gone with her, wherever she had gone. He turned back down the ridge. The cave was cool when he returned to it. The lizard was gone. The sky in the cave mouth had shifted, the light coming in at a different angle now. Falling across the inner wall and illuminating a fine crack in the stone that ran from floor to ceiling, faintly white against the grey. He had not noticed that crack before, though it must have been there. He sat with his back against the cave wall. The pine wreath on his head was dry now, the resin where the stem had broken going hard and pale. He could still smell it. He would cut a fresh one tomorrow or the day after. The trees outside made their sound. Very faint, almost nothing. He thought about her hands touching the pine bark, the ease of it, as if the tree had been waiting for exactly that contact and had received it without surprise. He did not yet know her name. He would learn it later, and later still he would find himself searching the high slopes for her and coming back to the pines instead, their rough bark under his hand, their scent unchanged, their roots going all the way down. Something moved through the pines outside. Wind, probably, only wind. He listened to it pass and did not go out. The night passed without disturbance. He slept with the pine wreath still on his head, and in the morning it was there beside him on the stone floor, having slipped off some time before dawn. The resin had left a faint mark on his temple, pale and sticky. He pressed 2 fingers against it and felt the roughness. Then he left the cave. The pines were loud with wind that morning. A different quality of sound from the evening stillness, more movement in the upper branches, a kind of continuous low rushing that filled the ridge and spilled down toward the lower slopes. He did not go back up to the high trees. He went the other way, following the ridge downward toward the stream courses, and from there southeast, following the valley as it opened toward flatter ground. He had done this before, moving away from the familiar in no particular direction. Arcadia was his, and he knew most of it, but not all of it, not yet. The marshes along the river Ladon lay in the lower ground where the hills flattened. He had passed through this country in other seasons, but now, in the long dry hold of late summer, the reeds stood very tall, and the air above them was thick and warm and smelled of mud and standing water and the particular green sharp scent of reed growth, a different country from the pines above. Heavier, still in a different way. He moved through it without hurrying. The reeds shifted around him. Their stalks brushed against each other in the slight warm breeze that ran close to the water, a sound like whispering, but without content. He heard her before he saw her, not laughter this time. Motion. The reeds parting ahead of him quickly, the sound of feet on wet ground. And then the brief flash of movement through the reed stems, there and gone, the way movement looks from a distance when broken into sections by tall growth. Quick. Deliberate, away from him. He knew what was happening. He had known it before with others. The tension of pursuit without wanting to pursue, the knowledge that the moving shape was moving because of him, that his presence had converted something easy and private into something urgent. He stopped walking. The reeds went on shifting. The sound of her moving through them grew fainter. He could still track the direction, northeast, toward where the Ladon ran deeper and the reed beds thickened around the bends. He stood in the warm, heavy air and listened to the sound getting smaller. He followed anyway. He would carry this knowledge later, and it would not make him lighter. He moved through the reeds, and the reeds moved back into place behind him, and the sound of his passage was louder than he wished. She was faster. The gap between them did not narrow. The river was ahead. He could hear the water, a low, steady sound under the rush of the reeds and the wind. The light changed as the reed beds broke near the bank, brighter here, the sun dropping full onto the water and the wide mud margins. He came out of the reeds and stopped. She was at the water's edge. Her back was to him. Her hands were open at her sides. She did not turn. He could see, even across the distance of the bank, that she was speaking. Her lips moved. The words were not for him. They went to the river, or to the reeds that bent over the water, or to the sisters she was calling. He would understand this later. He understood enough of it now. He took one step forward. She went into the water, or she did not. What happened at the water's edge happened quickly, and not the way he could follow with his eyes. She was there, and then the reeds along the bank bent in a way that had nothing to do with the wind. And then she was not there, only the reeds. Tall, green, their stalks touching each other at the joints, that same quiet sound of reed against reed in the warm air. Pan stood on the bank. The water moved past. The current did not know what had occurred. The mud at the edge showed the impression of her feet, small and close together, and then nothing, as if the ground itself had received her and closed behind her. He stood there for a long time. The sun was high, and the air above the marsh had that particular heavy stillness of midday. His feet were in the mud. He had not noticed stepping forward. Later they would say he wept. He may have. He breathed, at least, and the breathing was unsteady. The reeds were very close. They grew along the bank in dense clusters, hollow-stemmed, and the warm air moved through them at irregular intervals, producing a thin, incomplete sound, not music. Almost. He cut several stems with the edge of his hand, breaking them at the node. They came apart with a soft resistance. He held them, still wet from the mud. They smelled of green and river water and nothing else. Nothing of her remained in them that he could detect. He pressed them together, held them to his mouth, breathed across the cut ends unevenly, a rough exhalation that was not yet deliberate. The sound that came back was thin, reedy, plaintive in a way he had not intended. He adjusted the angle, breathed again. The sound changed, lower, a sound that moved outward across the marsh surface and did not stop at the far bank. It carried into the reeds and then beyond them, up the long slope toward the distant pines, and then further over the ridge into the cooler air above. He stood with the reeds pressed to his lips and the mud soft beneath his feet. The river moved past. The reeds along the bank bent and straightened, bent and straightened. The sound he was making was neither grief nor music yet, but it was becoming one or the other, or possibly both. He did not know her name even now. He had not learned it before she was gone. He would carry this particular absence the way he carried the pine wreath, not as decoration, but as the form a loss takes when it has nowhere else to go. The reeds held their shape in his hands, cut and hollow and smelling of the Ladon's water. The sound they made when he breathed across them was not her voice and not her laughter, but it was made from what she had become. He did not put them down. The afternoon moved slowly across the marsh. Pan stood at the bank long after the sun had passed its highest point. The reeds pressed together in his hands. He turned them once, adjusting the alignment, and breathed across the cut ends again. The sound that returned to him was low and uneven. It moved out across the water and disappeared. He had not planned to stay. He had not planned anything since midday. The Ladon ran past him, indifferent and clear. A dragonfly settled on the mud near his foot and held still for a long time. The air above the marsh shimmered in the heat. Somewhere behind him, in the denser reed growth, a bird moved with a small repeated sound and then stopped. He breathed across the reeds again. This time the sound carried further. He heard it go, across the water, into the reeds of the far bank, and then up through the open ground beyond. It lifted. Something in the angle of his hands, or the pressure of his breath, or the particular spacing of the stems had changed. The sound rose slightly at the end and then fell, not deliberately. Not yet, but he noted it. He adjusted his grip. The afternoon continued around him without requiring anything from him. He had felt this quality of stillness before, on the high ridges in midsummer, in the hour when no shepherd moved his flock and the goats lay down in whatever shade they could find. The wilderness holding itself carefully, as if setting something fragile on a shelf, his hour. He had always understood it as his own, a silence that spread outward from his presence. Standing here now, he was less certain of that. The music moved into the stillness and did not disturb it. That was not what he had expected. He had expected the sound of the pipes to feel like intrusion, too sharp, too present, against the dense heat of the afternoon. But the notes went into the stillness, and the stillness opened for them, and then closed again afterward, the way water opens for a stone and settles behind it. He played longer than he intended. By the time he stopped, the shadows had shifted. The mud beneath his feet had begun to cool slightly. The light on the river was lower and more orange and moved differently on the surface, less direct, more diffuse. He had been standing on the bank for most of the afternoon. He looked down at the reeds in his hands. 5 stems, cut unevenly, pressed together with the longer ones staggered. His thumbs had pressed marks into the outer stems where he had been gripping them. The hollow ends, where they were cut, were slightly worn from his breath. He was not sure what he had made. It was not her. He knew that. He had known it from the first thin sound. But it was made from the same hollow stem she had become, shaped by his hands and breath, carrying the form of a loss that had no other form. He did not think this was sufficient. He did not think it was nothing. He turned away from the river. The path back through the reeds was narrow and familiar. He walked it slowly. The reed stalks touched his shoulders as he moved and made that dry sound, the stalk against stalk sound he had been hearing all day, and he stopped once to listen to it separately. It was not what the pipes made, but it was close to what the pipes were trying to make, and he carried that thought with him as he walked. The marsh gave way to open ground. The pines were visible above him. On the upper slope, their shapes dark against the lowering sky. He had spent most of his days in those trees, on the higher ground where the air moved freely and smelled of resin, and where pitties had once walked ahead of him through the morning light. The pine wreath still sat against his temple, dry and faintly sharp. The resin mark it had left there was a permanent thing. He paused at the edge of the open ground and looked up the slope. The pines stood quiet in the early evening. No wind reached them from this direction. Their needles held still. He looked at the reeds in his hands and then back at the trees. There was a contest he did not know about yet. It would happen on a distant mountain, far from Arcadia, on the slope of Tmolus, where the mountain itself served as judge. He would stand there one day with these same reeds pressed to his mouth and play, as he was playing now, the music that had been made from Los and from the marsh at midday. A god would be listening. Two gods, and a mortal king who sat between them without understanding what he had been invited to witness. The king would say what he thought. He would mean it honestly. Pan did not know this. He lifted the pipes to his mouth and played one phrase, not long, into the still air between the marsh and the pines. The sound moved up the slope toward the trees and faded before it reached them. Something about the way it faded was worth noting, not because it diminished, all sounds diminish with distance, but because of where it went. Across the open ground, up the slope, into the space between the trees where the light was failing and the air was cool, a sound looking for an audience it had not yet found. He began to walk toward the pines. The ground rose gently under his hooves. The grass was dry and short, and the smell changed as he climbed, the marsh scent giving way to the warmer, drier smell of the hillside, and then above that the first edge of pine resin, faint and clean. He breathed it in. The reeds were still in his hands. By the time he reached the tree line, the last of the direct light had left the valley behind him. The marsh was in shadow. The river caught the sky faintly and held a narrow strip of pale colour. He turned and looked at it once from the higher ground. The reed beds were dark from here. He could not see the place where she had stood, or where the mud had held the impression of her feet. He turned back to the trees. The pines stood close together. Their roots spread across the ground, and he stepped between them carefully and found a place where the ground was level and dry, and where the bark of the nearest tree was smooth at shoulder height. He sat. The pipes rested across his knees. He ran his thumb along the cut ends of the reeds, feeling the edges. They were beginning to dry. The smell of river water was still faint in them. He pressed them to his lips once more and breathed out, not a full breath, just enough to know the sound was still there. It was. He set them down and looked through the trees at the darkening sky. There were shepherds somewhere on the far side of the ridge. He could not hear them from here. They had heard him, though. He was certain of that. The sound had travelled far in the still afternoon air, further than he had understood while he was playing. Somewhere below, on the slopes he could not see, a shepherd had paused beside his flock and listened to something moving across the hills from the south. A thin, low sound. Unfamiliar. They would hear it again. They would not always know what to call it or where it came from. Music that arrived at midday when the sun was highest and the shadows went directly down and the world stood in its own heat without moving. They would learn, after a time, to be still when it came and to say nothing until it passed. Some of them would learn that lesson more slowly than others. Pan rested against the pine tree. The wreath was dry above his ear. The reeds lay across his knees, hollow and light, smelling of the ladon cut from the bank where the mud had accepted a set of small footprints and given nothing back. The dark settled quietly into the forest around him. The night held for a while without changing. Pan sat with his back against the pine and let the dark come fully in. The reeds were cool now across his knees. The valley below had gone entirely quiet. No shepherd's call, no movement of water audible from this height, only the faint settling sounds of the trees as the air cooled, a creak in the upper branches, a brief shifting of needles. He was not thinking about the contest yet. He could not have been. It was still years ahead of him, folded into time he had not yet entered. What he was thinking about, if thinking is the right word for it, was the sound the pipes had made when the phrase faded across the open ground, the place where the sound had gone. Not quite silence and not quite continuation, something between those two things. He picked the reeds up and turned them once in his hands. The mountain of T-Molus was the place he had not yet visited. It stood in Lydia, far from Arcadia, on land where the air smelled different and the rivers ran gold-flecked from the hills. He would go there, in the time that came later, not by intention, but by the kind of drifting that happens when a god follows the sound of his own music across a wide landscape. He would arrive at a slope above the valley and find it already arranged, the stone seat of the mountain god prepared, the oak leaves pulled back from T-Molus's ears. The air expectant in a way that meant something had been decided above him before he arrived. Apollo would be there. This is the part worth holding steadily, because it is easy to misjudge. Apollo was not a god of cruelty, not precisely. He was a god of precision, of form, of the correct thing rendered exactly. His lyre rang clear and formal, each note placed with the authority of a god who had never cut an instrument from grief. The sound was perfect. There was no question it was perfect. T-Molus heard it and knew it immediately, the way a mountain knows the difference between weather and wind. Pan had played first. He had pressed the 5 reeds to his lips and played the music that had been living in him since the morning on the Ladon, the low, wandering phrases that moved like water through tall grass. That arrived at no clear destination. That did not resolve so much as subside. It was not formal music. It owed nothing to structure or correct proportion. It was the sound of a marsh at midday, of reeds growing where a nymph had stood, of a god breathing loss into hollow stems and finding it still had a voice. The slopes of T-Molus had listened without moving. Then Apollo had played. The sound of the lyre came down the mountain like light comes down, clean, directional, impossible to argue with. T-Molus had nodded. The judgment went to Apollo. There was no surprise in it. Pan had set the pipes down from his lips and stood with the reed tips cooling against his palm and felt not defeat exactly, but something close to the feeling of a sound fading before it reaches the trees. Distance was not failure. But it was still distance. Midas had been there. This was the part that mattered. Midas was a mortal king. A man of Phrygia, who had come to the mountain that day because he liked music and had not thought carefully about what it meant to sit between 2 gods and be asked which one played better. He was not a foolish man, not entirely. He had a genuine preference. He had listened to both, and the pipes had reached something in him that the lyre, perfect as it was, had not touched. He said so. Plainly, honestly, without any attempt to soften it. Apollo turned to look at him. Pan remembered the quality of that look, not furious, not theatrical, simply precise. The god of light looking at a mortal who had said the wrong thing with complete sincerity and now stood very still in the full measure of that error. The ears came quietly. Midas reached up and found them already changed. Long, grey, furred, rotating slightly with a reflex that was not his own. The ears of an ass, sitting above his very human face in the clear air of T-Molus's slope. He made a sound, not quite a word. He brought his hands down slowly. Pan had not moved. The pipes were still in his hand. 5 stems, staggered lengths, the hollow ends faintly worn. The same reeds he had carried from the Ladon. He stood on the slope of a Lydian mountain and looked at the mortal king who had chosen his music and was now carrying that choice in his ears for the rest of his life. There was nothing to say. Pan had not asked Midas to speak. The choice had been Midas's own. The consequences were Apollo's own. What sat between those two facts was simply the distance between a god who makes music from grief and a god who makes music from light, and the unanswerable question of what a mortal is supposed to do when asked to stand between them and choose. He set the pipes against his lips one last time. He played a single phrase, short, low, the same phrase he had played across the open ground in Arcadia, the one that faded before it reached the trees. On the slope of Tmolus it faded the same way, up the hillside, into the space between the oaks where the air was cool and the light was even, and the mountain sat with its stone patience above all of it. Apollo had already turned away. Midas stood with his new ears tilted forward in the breeze. He would hide them under a Phrygian cap for the rest of his life, and his barber would tell the secret to a hole in the earth. And the hole would grow reeds, and the reeds in the wind would speak the secret aloud to anyone passing. That was how these things moved. Through hollow stems, through the breath that entered grief and came out music. Pan walked down the slope. He did not hurry. The mountain's shadow was long behind him. The Lydian valley below was green and warm, the river running where it always ran, indifferent to what had been decided above it. He walked with the reeds in his hand, the pine wreath dry above his ear, and the resin mark still there at his temple where it had always been. The slope flattened out into foothills. The foothills gave way to the road. He would find his way back to Arcadia. He always did. The land there knew his step, knew the weight of him, knew the particular sound his hooves made on the dry ground above the Ladon. He would return to the pine forest and the marsh below it, and the river that ran clear and cold and said nothing. The pipes would go with him. They had outlasted one contest and would outlast others. They were made from what could not be held, and that was exactly what made them useful. The music they carried was not perfect, not in the way a lyre is perfect, but it went where the lyre could not go. Into the silence of midday, into the place where the open ground met the tree line, and the sound faded without diminishing. Somewhere above the valley the oaks were still. The mountain had already forgotten the day, or was holding it the way mountains hold things, fully. Without moving, with no particular intention of letting go. The road back to Arcadia was long. Pan knew its length the way he knew the length of the reeds against his palm, not by measuring but by the feel of it, accumulated over years of the same return. He had walked it before, he would walk it again. But somewhere on that road his thoughts turned, not forward toward the pine forest and the Ladon, but backward, further back than Tmolus. Back past the contest and the oaks and Midas, standing in the breeze with his changed ears. Back to the high forests of Arcadia, before the reeds, before the river, before any of it. Back to Pitys. She had been in the forests above the Ladon, in the highest part of the hills where the pines grew so close together their canopy pressed out the noon light. She was a nymph of those high places. Not the meadows, not the rivers, the pines. She moved among them the way water moves, without effort, without announcing herself, present and then elsewhere before you could be certain she had been there at all. Pan had seen her first in autumn. The pines were unchanged, as pines are in autumn, but the lower slopes were turning, oak and maple going amber and rust, the whole hillside shifting its colour, while the high forest held still. She stood at the boundary between the two, one hand resting against pine bark, looking down at the colour below her. She was not aware of him. Or perhaps she was, and had made a decision about it. He had not called out. That was the thing he remembered. He had only watched. He came back to those forests over the following weeks. He moved among the trees and listened for her step, which was light and dry on the pine needles, almost inaudible. He found places she had been, a handprint in lichen, a branch bent back and not released, the faint impression of her in the air above a particular stone. He followed these traces without urgency. He was a god of patient things. He knew how to move without disturbing. Once he heard her singing, not loudly. A small sound, half-breath, the kind a person makes when they believe themselves alone. He sat very still on a rock above a gully and listened, the pipes resting across his knees, and did not play. There was a reason for that. He had learned by then that his music could overwhelm. It was not a gentle thing, his piping. It was honest, which was not always the same. So he listened instead, and for a while that was enough. Pitys knew he was there. She was not foolish, and he was not invisible. One morning she was sitting at the foot of a tall pine when he came around a stone outcrop, and they were simply facing each other, and there was nothing to do but acknowledge it. She looked at him without alarm. She had the calm of things that grow in high places, accustomed to exposure, accustomed to wind. She did not flee. He sat down at a short distance, and they remained there for a while with the pine trees above them and the cold air of the high forest around them. Eventually he took out the pipes. He played the low phrase, the one that wandered and faded, the one that went nowhere and arrived there without apology. She listened. She did not say it was beautiful. She did not say anything, but she did not leave. This was as close as things came between them. There were mornings after that when she was there and he was there, and they shared the high forest without needing to make anything of it. She had her own rhythms. She came and went along the ridge lines. He followed sometimes, at a comfortable distance, the pine needles giving softly under his hooves. She knew he followed. She did not object. He had thought in that time that something was being built, not quickly, not with declarations, but the way a tree builds from the inside without announcing its growth, adding a ring each year until the record is there in the wood. He had not understood that she was afraid. Or not afraid exactly. It was not the terror his mother had shown at his birth, that flight from something too strange to accommodate. It was something quieter. Pitys lived in the high pines because the high pines were still. She was a nymph of stillness. His music, low, wandering, unresolved as it was, carried inside it a restlessness that was not hers. She could hear it. Even the gentle phrases held it. The forward pull, the thing that kept seeking. He was, by his nature, the god of things that do not stay. She prayed on a morning in late winter, when the frost was still on the upper rocks, and the light was grey and flat, and the air had the particular quality of a day that has not decided what it will be. He was not there when she prayed. He came around the ridge and found the tall pine standing where she had been standing, and the bark was smooth and cold under his hand, and the needles were exactly as pine needles are, grey-green, gathered in pairs, smelling of cold resin. He stood there for a long time. The transformation was her own. Her sisters, who watched over such things, had given her what she asked for. That was how these matters worked. The prayer was genuine. The answer came. He understood this. It did not make the bark under his palm feel any different. He took a branch of pine before he left. A small one. He shaped it into a rough wreath and set it above his ear, and the resin came off on his temple, and that mark stayed. It was there on the slope of Tmolus years later. It was there now, on the road between Lydia and Arcadia. The dry pine wreath, faintly fragrant in the cooler air. He wore it because she had asked for stillness and found it, and the least he could do was carry the smell of it with him. That was what the pine meant, not grief displayed, not mourning announced. Simply the continued presence of what had been, carried forward with no more ceremony than a dry wreath above the ear of a god walking a long road home. The reeds at his side were the same. Syrinx had become the instrument. Pitys had become the wreath. They were both still with him. They had not been lost. They had only changed the form in which they travelled. He adjusted the wreath above his ear and walked on. The road was still long. The light was going toward afternoon. Ahead, somewhere beyond the hills that were not yet Arcadian hills, the pine forests waited. And the river ran cold below the marsh, and the dry ground above the Ladon still held the shape of his passing in the memory of its dust. The road dipped through a dry valley before it rose again toward the next set of hills. Pan walked through the valley's shadow, the afternoon light already narrowing above the ridgeline. The wreath above his ear was warm from the sun. The pipe swayed at his hip. He was thinking about Dionysus, not because the road prompted it, not because anything particular had brought the god of wine to mind. It was the way memory worked on long roads. One thread pulled at another. And the next thing you knew, you were somewhere entirely different from where you had started. He had known Dionysus for a long time, longer than he could place with any precision. That was how it was with gods whose natures overlapped at their outer edges. They did not meet so much as find each other already present in the same wild hour. The first time he placed them together clearly was a valley in the hills north of Arcadia. At a night gathering of the Dionysian company, the maenads were moving through the trees. The satyrs were crashing through undergrowth with the particular enthusiasm of creatures who know their own noise. Torches moved between the pines. Wine had been poured at the roots of the old oaks. Pan had heard them from 3 hills away. The sound carried in the dark. He had come, not because he was summoned, but because the sound moved through him the way certain music moves, not sweetly, but necessarily. He arrived, and Dionysus was already looking at him from across the clearing. Dionysus had a way of looking that held no surprise in it, as if he had expected you some time ago and had simply continued without you until now. His wreath was vine, Pan's was pine. They stood on opposite sides of the fire, and both of them held this in their expression, the slight recognition of seeing a related thing in different form. No greeting was made. None was needed. Pan took out the pipes and played. He played the low wandering phrase at first, the one that went nowhere, but the company was too alive for that. So the phrase changed. It rose and opened, and the rhythm in it became something with hooves in it. Something that the maenads could move to, and they did, their feet finding the beat, the way feet do when a god is playing rather than a man. The pines went dark above them. The torches threw amber light across the ground. Pan played, and the night gathered itself around the sound. Afterward Dionysus sat on a stone, and Pan sat on a log not far from him, and the company drifted into its own conversations among the trees. Between them there was the comfortable silence of 2 gods who had just done a thing together and did not need to discuss it. Dionysus spoke first. He said, "Your pipes do not grieve tonight." Pan turned the reeds over in his hands. He said, "No, not tonight." And that was the whole of it. Dionysus poured wine into the dark earth at his feet, a small offering to whatever was listening in the roots, and Pan watched the dark stain spread and dry. That was the thing about Dionysus. He did not make the wild sacred. He simply moved through it as it already was. Pan understood this. He had spent his whole life in sacred places that required no ceremony because the wilderness did not ask for ceremony, it asked only for presence. Dionysus was present in the same way. They did not agree on everything. Pan's hours were the noon hour and the grey hour before dawn. Dionysus moved at night, at the height of the revel, where sound was enormous and bodies moved close in torchlight. Pan's wildness was the stillness at the centre of things. Dionysus's wildness was the dissolution at the outside. But there was territory between them, and in that territory they were the same god wearing different names. He thought of a night on the slopes of Mount Cithaeron. Years later, when the revel had gone on long enough that even the satyrs were sitting down. Pan had played until the phrase was fully unwound, all its wandering done, and the music had settled into something so low and steady it was almost breath. Dionysus had been lying on his back looking at the trees, his vine wreath crooked over one ear. He said, without lifting his head, "That phrase sounds like a road that does not end." Pan had looked at the pipes in his hands. He said, "Yes." He had meant, I know, he had meant it was a road before it was a phrase. He had meant, the music goes where I have been, and it does not stop there. It keeps going, because I keep going, and there is no conclusion to walk toward. Dionysus seemed to understand this without being told. He nodded once and said nothing more. That was the quality of the friendship. Nothing explained. Nothing required. Two gods who lived at the outer edges of what the Olympians knew how to name, finding in each other the quiet confirmation that they were not alone in being difficult to name. The satyrs were different, noisier, more immediate in their warmth. They came to Pan's music with their whole bodies, as creatures who had no complicated history with it, no understanding of what the reeds had been before they were reeds. They heard the music, and they moved. Pan appreciated this. There was something clean in it. But with Dionysus there was understanding, the kind that comes not from closeness, but from likeness. Two creatures made of wildness and restlessness, meeting in the dark and recognizing the other's nature without needing to examine it. Pan walked up out of the valley now into the afternoon light. The hills ahead were drier, limestone showing through the scrub. A hawk hung in the warm air above the ridge and then was gone. He thought of the last time he had seen Dionysus, somewhere in the eastern hills, the company moving west toward the sea. The god had paused on a ridge and turned back. The vine wreath was fresh, dark leaves against his hair. He looked at Pan the way you look at something you do not expect to lose, and are not afraid to lose, but are aware you have. That particular look. Pan had lifted the pipes once in farewell, not playing, just holding them up briefly in the afternoon light. Dionysus had turned and gone on with his company. That was how it went with the two of them. No ceremony in the meeting and no ceremony in the parting. The wildness continued in both directions. Each god back to his own hours, the noon silence and the night revel, the lone hillside and the torch-lit grove. Pan touched the pine wreath above his ear. The resin smell was fainter now in the warm afternoon. He pressed the wreath more firmly against his temple, where the mark had long since stopped being visible, but had not stopped being there. The Arcadian hills were closer. The air was not yet cooler, but it would be. The pines were still some hours ahead. He walked on through the limestone scrub, the pipes quiet at his side, the hawk somewhere above him now, or somewhere else entirely, and the road still going where roads go. The road climbed out of the scrub onto a long flat shelf of limestone. Pan stopped there. Not to rest. He was not tired. He stopped because something in the air had changed. It was subtle. The kind of thing you notice before you understand it. A particular quality of stillness that was not the noon stillness, that was his own, the sacred, dangerous hour he knew from the inside. This was different. This was a stillness that came from outside him, moving toward him across the dry ground. He had felt it before, on a hillside above Tegea, on the road south of Mantinea, the way the air gathered before a thing that needed to happen. Below the shelf the road continued north, and on that road, coming up toward him through the white afternoon, a man was running. Pan watched him. The man ran as men do when they have been running for a long time. His arms moved loosely. His head was down. His sandals raised a small trail of dust, and then the dust settled and there was only the sound of feet on dry ground, steady and diminishing. Pan knew what this was. He had seen runners before. He had seen men moving between cities with news folded inside them like water in a sealed vessel, carrying it carefully even as the body spent itself. This one's name was Pheidippides. Pan did not know it yet, but he would learn it. That was how memory worked. The name came later. The face came first. The runner crested the limestone shelf and slowed. His breathing was loud and rough. He was heading to Sparta with a message in his chest and several days of road still ahead of him. And he had the look of a man who had already decided to keep going, regardless of what his body said about it. He did not see Pan at first. Most men did not. Pan waited. Then the runner stopped. He stood on the flat shelf of rock with his hands on his knees, breathing. He looked up. He found Pan watching him from the loose scrub at the road shoulder, and he did not run. This was notable. The usual response to Pan, seen suddenly and close, was flight. The chest seizing, the legs already moving before the mind had instructions. That was the panic rising, the god's oldest and least deliberate gift to the world. Most men received it without asking. This one was too tired to run, or perhaps too full of other fears. Pan did not move. He stood where he was. The pipes at his side, the pine wreath above his ear, the goat leg still on the white stone. Pheidippides straightened slowly. He looked at Pan the way a man looks at a thing he was not expecting, but is too spent to be properly afraid of. There was acknowledgment in it. There was the quality of a man who has already given a great deal to this road, and has very little left for terror. Pan spoke. He said, "You are going south." The runner said, "Yes." "To Sparta. There is a fleet in the bay. Persian ships. They are landing men at Marathon." Pan said nothing for a moment. He looked at the road ahead. The limestone dropping back into scrub, the flat brown hills beyond. Then he said, "You carry the city on your back." Pheidippides looked at him carefully. He said, "I carry its message." Pan said, "Those are the same thing." The runner did not answer this. His breathing had steadied somewhat. He looked at Pan with the directness of a man who has stopped worrying about propriety. He said, "Will you help us?" This was the question, the actual question, underneath the road and the message and the fleet in the bay. Pheidippides had run past this mountain before, and he knew what god was said to live on its slopes, and he was asking plainly. Pan considered it. He was not a god of cities. He had never been. The Acropolis was a hill with walls on it. The Agora was a flat place with too many voices. His hills were the ones with goats on them, and springs that had no names. Athens was a distant arrangement of stones seen occasionally from heights. It had not been his concern, but he understood what was pressing toward the plain at Marathon. He had felt the movement of it from a distance for several days now, something large moving through unfamiliar landscape. A mass of men in unfamiliar dust. The birds had been wrong. The goats had been unsettled for 2 nights running. The wilderness felt the approach before the cities did. Pan had noticed all of it, and had not yet decided what it meant to him. He looked at Pheidippides. He said, "Go to Sparta. Bring back what you can." Then he said, "I know what is coming to Marathon. I have been watching it." The runner's face did not change, but something in his posture did, the tightness of a man listening hard. Pan said, "Tell your generals, when the time comes, what begins in the plain will not finish the way they expect." Pheidippides held this. He said, "What will you do?" Pan said only, "Go." The runner went. He was down the slope and into the white distance in a time that said he had found something to run toward. Pan watched him go until the dust settled and the road was empty again. He stood for a while on the limestone shelf. What happened at Marathon Pan had not planned it carefully. That was not how his gifts worked. The panic was not a thing he aimed. It moved through the plain, the way noon silence moved through an Arcadian forest. It entered through the gaps. It found the parts of a man that were already uncertain. The Persian force was vast, and it was disciplined, but discipline is a thin layer laid over older instincts, and Pan's panic reached beneath the layer. He remembered the plain in the grey hour before dawn, the smell of salt from the sea, the weight of men and metal on flat ground. He had moved through it without being seen. This was not the helm of Hades. This was something older. The wilderness knew how to be invisible to those who had not learned to look for it. And then the panic had come, and the line had broken. And the Athenians had pressed forward into the confusion, and the plane had done what planes do when the balance tips. Pan had not stayed to watch the end of it. He had moved back into the hills before the light came fully up. He did not need to see the finish. He knew what had happened. The goats knew. The birds knew. The air had changed in that particular way that follows the end of a thing. What came after was Athens, the cave on the north slope of the Acropolis. The honey left at the entrance in small clay vessels, milk poured on the threshold stone. The Athenians doing what Athenians did when they owed a debt, building and naming and marking with ceremony. Pan had gone to the cave because it was a cave, and it faced north, and it was cool inside. That was the primary reason. The offerings were a secondary matter. He received them without ceremony, because nothing in him required ceremony. He sat in the dark with the pipes on his knees and listened to the city below the rock, all its noise and argument, and found it less grating than he had expected. He had felt, sitting in that cave, the strange doubling of his life, the god of remote places, now with a shrine inside the city walls, the god of goats and shepherds, now thanked by soldiers, the god of loneliness, now briefly necessary. He had pressed the pine wreath to his temple in the dark of the cave. The resin smell was strong then. He had held it there for a while. Then he had gone back to Arcadia, back to the hills he knew from the inside. The cave on the Acropolis remained. The offerings continued. He did not always go to receive them. He did not need to. The wilderness did not require that he witness every act of recognition. He came down off the limestone shelf now and onto the road again. The afternoon was moving. The light had lost some of its white intensity. The pines were still ahead. The drier hills continued on both sides. His hooves were quiet on the dust. The hawk was not visible. The road went on. The road bent slightly here, curving around a low outcrop of pale rock. Pan followed the bend without thinking about it. His hooves found the dust naturally, the way they always found whatever ground was under them. He was thinking about Echo. Not deliberately. The memory came on its own, the way memories do when a body is walking and the mind has been left to wander. One thought leads to another in the quiet, and the quiet on this road was considerable. He had known Echo in the valleys. That was her country, the deep cuts between hills where sound moves strangely, where a voice thrown from one slope would return, change from the other. She had been at home in those places, the way Pan was at home in the high scrub. She understood the geography of resonance. She lived inside it. He had heard her before he had seen her. That was always the way with Echo. Her voice arrived first, ahead of her, slipping around corners of rock and down through brush. She had a laugh that carried. He had followed the sound of it through 2 valleys before he found her standing at a stream crossing, looking entirely unsurprised. She had known he was coming. Of course she had. She heard everything. What passed between them after that was not simple to describe. It had not been simple to live through. He had wanted her company, and she had given it, partially, on days that suited her, in places of her choosing. She came near on her terms and kept distance on the rest. He understood this. In the way that he understood goats, they approached when they chose, and bolted when they chose, and there was no point in reasoning with either decision. But Echo's distance had a particular quality. It was not indifference. When he played the pipes near her valleys, the sound came back to him from the hills, and it came back changed. Not distorted, changed. She gave his music back with something added to it, some thickness of air, some quality of the stone it had touched in passing. He had come to understand that as conversation. It was the conversation she was able to have. He remembered playing alone on a hillside above the river Laden one afternoon, not unlike this afternoon. Though the hills there were lower and greener, and hearing the phrases come back to him from across the valley, each phrase returning after a pause. Each return a little softer than the original, the way an answer is quieter than a question. He had played longer than usual that day, just to hear it continue. That was the paradox of echo. Her refusal to give him what he wanted was also the thing that made the wanting tolerable. The echo was not her. But it was the shape of her attention. He had learned to take what was there rather than grieve for what was not. He rounded another curve in the road. The pines were closer now. He could see the dark line of them against the pale sky, maybe a quarter hour ahead on foot. The scrub on either side had grown slightly denser. Dry grasses bent over the road's edge, yellow and brittle. No wind moved them. He had followed Echo for a long time through those valleys, longer than was wise, perhaps, though wisdom was never the issue. He was a god of wildness, and wildness does not stop at the sensible boundary. He had pursued her the way water pursues the low place, not with urgency, just with consistent downward motion, because that was the direction. And Echo had kept moving, kept staying just past the range of reaching, her voice always a little ahead, her laughter returning from the rocks just as he turned the corner where it had been. He remembered one morning in particular. Early, the mist still in the valleys. He had climbed a hillside in the blue light before dawn and called her name across the quiet. One call, just her name. And her name had come back from somewhere far up the valley, softer, diminished by distance. And then again from a different slope, softer still, and then from somewhere much farther away that might have been her or might have been the hills themselves, taking up the sound and passing it from stone to stone until it faded into the white air. He had stood there in the mist and listened to his own voice coming back to him in pieces, smaller and smaller, farther and farther, until the last return was barely sound at all. More like the memory of sound than sound itself. He had not called again. There was nothing more to say that the hills had not already answered. When he played the pipes in her valleys now, the echo was still there. That had not changed. The hills still returned his music, still gave back the last phrase of whatever he played, still made the sound into a conversation with itself. He did not know if she heard it still. He did not know the full shape of what had become of her. He knew only that certain valleys in Arcadia had a particular quality of return, a patience in the stone that other places lacked. He touched the pipe stems briefly with one hand. Not to play, just to confirm they were there. The pines were close enough now that he could see individual trees, the rough dark bark, the heavy lower branches. The shade they made was real shade. It would be cooler under them. The road passed directly through a narrow stand of them before opening again on the other side, according to what he remembered of this route. He thought of Echo's voice in the morning mist. Then he thought of Syrinx and the reeds, and the Wayloss had a way of becoming music if he held it long enough and breathed across it correctly. Every absence in his life had made a sound. That was the thing he had come to understand over the long years. Pitties in the pine boughs overhead, Syrinx in the reed pipes at his side, Echo in the valleys below, returning his own voice to him, stripped of everything except the note itself. Each one a different kind of return. He was not sure if this was consolation or simply the nature of things, both perhaps. He had stopped trying to separate them. The first pines reached over the road. Cool shadow crossed his shoulders. The smell of resin came immediately, dry and clean. His hand went to the pine wreath above his ear, brief and automatic, the way it sometimes did when the smell was strong. The road went on into the green dark between the trees. His hooves were quieter here. The dust gave way to a floor of dry needles. The brown hills were out of sight for a moment, hidden behind the trunks. He walked through the shade and did not hurry. The road curved slightly as it moved through the pines, and the light changed. Not dark, but filtered. Green and dim and still, the way afternoon light becomes something else when it passes through a canopy of needles. Pan moved with it. His hooves found the dry needle floor without much sound. The trunks stood close on either side, their bark grey-black in the shade, rough as old rope if he had reached out to touch it. He did not reach out. He had walked through pine stands like this his whole life and knew their texture by memory rather than by touch. The resin smell was stronger here, dense. It was the smell of something slow and patient, a process of sealing and preserving that took years to complete. He breathed it in without thinking. There was a sound somewhere above him, a small bird moving through the upper branches. He tracked it briefly without looking up, as one does when sound is more informative than sight. The bird moved from one tree to the next and then was quiet. Then the pines were quiet around him again. He was thinking about Psyche. He had not thought of her in some time, not deliberately, but the road and the afternoon had a way of surfacing things without asking permission. That was the nature of long walking. The mind went where it went. He had found her at a riverbank. Not the Ladon, a different river, greener at its edges, slower, somewhere in that uncertain country between the wild places and the world of mortals. She had been sitting on the bank with her feet near the water, and her hands in her lap and her head low, the posture of someone past the usual kinds of sorrow and into something more exhausted. Something that did not have a word in the ordinary language of grief. He had come to the bank the way he came to most places. Quietly, following a sound, following the particular silence that follows a sound, and there she was. She had not fled from him. That itself was notable. Most mortals, catching sight of him at the edge of a river, did one of two things. They went rigid with the shock of him, that locked stillness before the panic took hold, or they simply ran without looking back. Psyche had done neither. She had looked up slowly, as if she had already been waiting for something she could not name, and found that this was it. He had recognized what was in her face, not because he was a god of mortals or a god of their inner lives, but because he was a god of remote places, and remote places taught a particular curriculum. Isolation, endurance. The long practice of continuing when the reason for continuing was not immediately visible. She was attempting the trials set by Aphrodite. He knew this the way he knew most things about the world below the Olympian palaces, through the ordinary intelligence of a god who spent his time in the places where information gathered at its own pace. No thunder, no decree, just the slow accumulation of what passed through the wild margins. He had sat down a little apart from her, near enough to speak, far enough that the gesture did not press. The river moved. It had that particular sound of water over flat stone, a low, constant murmur with occasional shifts in pitch where the bottom changed. He had listened to it for a moment before speaking. He told her that despair was a reasonable response. He said this plainly, without softening it into something else. The trials were cruel. Aphrodite was not in the business of kindness when her authority felt challenged, and Psyche had challenged it simply by existing in a way that drew comparison. That was how divine cruelty tended to begin. Not with malice exactly, but with the cold logic of precedence. Psyche had said nothing for a long moment. He had added that endurance was also a reasonable response, not because it was noble or because the gods were watching and would reward it, but because the alternative was to stop at the river and the task was still ahead. He was not a god of eloquent counsel. He had no tradition of prophecy, no ritual associated with wisdom-giving. He was a god of goats and hillsides and the sudden wordless fear that comes in an empty field at noon. What he had was the knowledge of long exposure to hard country, the knowledge that things continued past the point that seemed like the last possible point. He had told her this in simple language, the way a shepherd would tell it to another shepherd stranded on a cold hillside. Not inspiring, not false, just the information that the path was still there. She had lifted her head a little more. He remembered the light on the river behind her, the way it moved in small bright pieces across the surface, the way she sat with it behind her, pale and worn and still here, still at the bank, still holding the shape of herself together with what was left, he had not stayed long. That was not the nature of the encounter. He was not her guardian or her companion on the trials. He was a god she had met at a river bank, and he had said what was true, and that was the whole of it. She had to go on from there by her own motion. But he had watched her stand, watched her look at the path along the river, watched the decision move through her, the way decisions sometimes move through a person, not with a visible moment of resolution, but with a slow gathering of direction, like water finding the grade of the ground. Then she had gone. He came out of the pine stand. The road opened again onto the hillside, paler and drier than the shade he had left. The afternoon light hit his shoulders. Below and ahead, the Arcadian hills fell away toward lower ground, darker green where the water was, yellower and more exposed above it. He walked out of the shade without stopping. The pine wreath sat above his ear. He touched it once, briefly, as the resin smell thinned and the open air came back. She had survived the trials. He had heard this in the way he heard most things, not through announcement, but through the slow settling of the story into the landscape, as if the world incorporated outcomes quietly, adjusting its texture around what had happened. He moved downhill at his usual pace. The dry grasses along the road bent slightly as he passed, not from wind, just proximity. The way things nearest to motion register the motion first. The river would be audible before long. He knew this road. The river came to him before he expected it, a low sound first, half buried under the dry movement of air across the hillside. Then fuller, as the road curved left and the ground levelled briefly before dropping again. He had walked this way many times. The road knew him in the way that roads know the things that use them without using them up. There was a thought moving in him as he walked. Not a new thought, more like a thought that had been waiting at the edge of his attention for a long time, patient as water finding a crack in stone. He had spent the morning in the pine stand, and before that at the river bank with Psyche, and before that across the long earlier years of his life in these same hills with the same reeds in his hands and the same sky overhead. And the thing that the thought kept circling was this, that he had never once arrived at what he had gone toward, not once. Syrinx had become reed, Pitys had become pine. Echo had become sound itself, voice stripped of the body that carried it. Each time he had moved toward something, the movement itself had produced the transformation. What he reached was never what had been there a moment before. He stopped on the road. The hillside spread below him. The river was visible now, a thin, bright line through the darker green of the willows. It was not grief exactly, standing there with this thought. Grief moved. This was steadier than grief. He looked at the river below and thought about the shape of his life and found that it had the same structure everywhere. Pursuit and transformation. Loss and instrument. The thing desired becoming the thing that sang. Syrinx had asked her sisters to change her. He had understood that, later, after the sharpness of it had settled into something he could examine without flinching, she had chosen the transformation rather than him. That was the plain fact of it, not unkindness exactly, just the preference for one state of being over another. He had not been enough of an alternative to what she feared. And from that, from her refusal, from her sister's compliance, from the cold stalks in his hands, had come the instrument that defined him, the thing most associated with his name, the pipes, the sound that could lull the wakeful into sleep, that had reached across Arcadia for years since, that had stood against Apollo's lyre on the slope of Tmolus and been judged lesser by everyone except the one listener honest enough to say otherwise. He moved again downhill toward the water. The sun was past its height. The midday hour had come and gone while he was in the pines. That dangerous still hour, his hour, when the wilderness held its breath and mortals who wandered into open places sometimes felt something press against them that had no visible source. His presence, or what his presence became when he was not paying attention to confining it, he had never entirely controlled that quality in himself. The panic. It rose from him the way heat rises from bare stone. Not a decision, not a power he summoned. Simply what he was, spilling outward in quiet moments. He had used it, yes. At Marathon, deliberately, like a tool. But he did not think of that as its truest nature. Its truest nature was this, the noon field, the empty path, the sudden cold certainty that something was watching from the tree line. That was his presence before he chose to be present. That was what he could not help. The nymphs had known this before they ran. He was fairly certain of it. The running was not about what he had done. It was about what he was. The cloven feet, the beard, the smell of animals and resin. The fact of him arriving out of the trees without warning, large and warm, and not quite what the world had room for in its ordered categories. He accepted this. He had accepted it for a long time. The road reached the willows. He pushed through the outer branches, the leaves brushing his shoulders, cool and dry. The river ran below a short bank, green and unhurried. He stood above it and looked down at the current. It occurred to him, not for the first time, that he had spoken to Psyche more honestly than he spoke to most. Not because she was special to him in the way Syrinx had been, or Pitys, but because she had been sitting at the edge of a river, considering whether to continue. And that was a situation he understood without need of explanation. He knew what it was to reach for something and find only marsh grass. He knew what the next moment after that felt like. The stillness before the hands understand what they are holding. Endurance was not the right word for what he had offered her. The right word was something closer to familiarity. He had told her, "This is a recognizable place. You are not lost. You are at the point where the path goes forward, and the reasons for going forward are not immediately legible. That place exists. It is not the end." She had gone. She had completed the trials. The world had absorbed that outcome and moved on. He sat down on the bank. The current ran below his feet, not touching him, but close enough that the coolness of it reached upward through the air. He set his hands in his lap. The pipes were at his belt. He did not lift them. There was a sound from across the water. A heron, lifting from the far bank in slow, heavy wing beats. He watched it rise and angle downstream until the willows took it. He had been born to a mother who ran. He had been carried to Olympus in hare-skins, a curiosity wrapped in borrowed warmth. He had been named by Zeus and welcomed by gods who had laughed with what seemed like genuine delight. And then he had come back here. Not because Olympus rejected him, because Arcadia was where he was from, in the way that mattered more than birth. The hills, the caves, the road he had walked without needing to look at his feet. He reached up and touched the pine wreath. The needles were dry. Some of them had broken during the walk. He could feel the brittle places where the stems had cracked. Pitys had become this wreath, or what the wreath was made of. That was the form the thought always took when he examined it, not an abstraction. The actual needles, the actual resin smell. She was present in that specific material, and he carried her in that specific way, and that was neither comfortable nor intolerable. It was simply true. The river ran. The light on it shifted with small clouds moving somewhere above the willows. He was a god of the places where no one was watching, where the only audience was the hillside itself, and the hillside kept everything it heard with equal indifference. His losses were there. His music was there. The long loop of pursuit and transformation, and the instruments that came after. He did not move from the bank for a long time. The water went on below him, steady and indifferent and present, asking nothing of what sat above it. After a while he rose from the bank. The afternoon had settled into a particular stillness. Not the midday weight that had lifted, but something thinner. The light lay flat across the water. The willows did not move. He turned away from the river and walked upstream along the bank, following the current's direction in reverse. The ground was soft here, darker than the road, and his hooves pressed into it without sound. The mud held each print cleanly and released it when he lifted his foot. He thought about the cave on the Acropolis, not often. But sometimes, when he was near water and the afternoon had gone still like this, the thought came back with unexpected clarity. The cave cut into the north face of the rock. It was not large. A low ceiling, rough walls, the floor worn smooth by years of bare feet crossing it. The Athenians had consecrated it to him after Marathon. They had sent offerings, honey cakes, small bowls of milk, garlands of pine. The first offerings had arrived still damp from the road, carried by a soldier who had crossed the plain in the hours after the battle and climbed the hill without stopping. Pan had been in the cave when the soldier came. He had been sitting in the dark near the back wall, pipes resting across his knees, listening to the city below with a kind of attention that required no effort. Athens made a distinctive sound, different from Arcadia. Stone instead of soil, wheels and sandals and water moving through cut channels rather than over rocks. He had learned to hear it the way he heard different birds. The sound had its own pattern, and the pattern told him things. The soldier had set the offerings at the cave mouth and knelt. He had not spoken aloud. That was what Pan remembered most clearly. The man had arranged the bowl and the garland with careful hands, and then he had pressed his forehead briefly to the stone floor, and then he had left. No request, no words spoken into the dark. Pan had sat with the smell of honey and pine moving toward him on the small draught from the entrance. He had not been sure what to do with gratitude offered that quietly. He was accustomed to fear. He was accustomed to the sudden recognition in a shepherd's eyes, the step back, the averted gaze. Gratitude was less legible to him than fear, and it arrived less often. But that soldier had knelt without looking into the cave, without needing to see whether anything was there. More came after. Not soldiers mostly, shepherds from the surrounding countryside. Farmers moving between villages who stopped because stopping had become a habit. The occasional young man who had not yet decided what he believed about the gods and stood at the cave entrance for a long time before leaving a small coin on the ledge. Pan had spent several seasons near the Acropolis, returning to the cave in the afternoons, sitting in its coolness while the city moved below. He had not announced himself. He was not a god who announced himself in cities. He sat in the dark and listened. The offerings accumulated on the ledge. Some spoiled, some were taken by birds. He did not touch them himself. They were for the god they believed was there, and that belief was its own kind of presence. Separate from what he actually was, he had watched one old woman come to the cave mouth on a morning when the mist had not yet lifted from the lower city. She moved slowly, carrying a small clay lamp already lit. She set it on the ledge beside the other things. She stood for a moment with her hands pressed flat together. Then she said something low that Pan could not fully hear from where he sat. He had leaned forward slightly. She was asking for her son, who had gone to sea. Not demanding, not bargaining. Simply telling him about it, the way a person speaks to someone in another room, unsure whether they can be heard. He had remained very still in the back of the cave. He did not have dominion over the sea. That was Poseidon's matter, and Pan had always maintained a careful distance from the other gods' territories. He had not made the sea quiet for her son. He had no means to do so. But he had listened. That was within his power. Listening cost nothing, and changed the texture of silence in ways that were hard to describe. The lamp had burned on the ledge for an hour after she left. He had watched it from inside. He paused on the riverbank now, one hand resting against the rough bark of a willow trunk. The cave on the Acropolis was far from here, a different kind of place, surrounded by city noise and offering smells, and the specific weight of human belief concentrated in a small enclosed space. Arcadia had no walls. Its belief was spread thin across the hills, living in the nervous awareness of a shepherd caught too long in an open field at noon. Both were real. Both were his. He understood this better now than he had when it started. The Athenians had needed a god of the open places to have also been present at their moment of greatest danger. So they had made him a cave in their city, which was perhaps the best translation they could manage. Wild things brought into stone and given a door, he did not mind it. He had sat in that cave many times and found the coolness of it not unlike the caves of Arcadia. The river moved beside him, green and slow. A fish broke the surface once, briefly, and was gone. He stayed where he was, hand against the willow bark, the rough surface of it pressed back against his palm. He counted the ridges without meaning to. The tree was old. Older than the city, possibly. It knew nothing of marathon or cave shrines or soldiers pressing their foreheads to stone floors in wordless thanks. The willow simply stood in the water. That was sufficient work for it. He thought that was probably the closest thing to philosophy he was going to arrive at today. He thought it without particular satisfaction or disappointment. The afternoon moved on around him. A small bird crossed from one bank to the other, low over the current, fast and direct. He watched it reach the far reeds and disappear. He took his hand from the willow. The road back to the hills was behind him. He turned toward it, hooves finding the soft ground, the river sound dropping behind him as he climbed. The pine wreath shifted on his brow. A few more needles fell, dry and light, catching no air on the way down. The hills of Arcadia came up slowly around him as he climbed. The river sound dropped away below. Above him the pine trees stood in their rows, dark and particular against the pale evening sky. He had walked this path enough times that his hooves knew it without instruction. The soft ground gave way to harder earth as the slope steepened. Roots crossed the path in low ridges. He stepped over each one without looking down. The light had shifted while he stood at the river. It was the flat, late light now, the kind that comes when the sun has moved behind the hills but has not yet released the sky to dark. Everything was visible, but nothing cast a shadow. The pines looked painted. The air had cooled by several degrees. He stopped where the path crested a low ridge and looked back across the valley. The river was a thread of dull silver below. The willows along its banks were dark shapes, their branches hanging without movement. No wind reached down into the valley at this hour. It rarely did. Somewhere on the far hillside a goat called once and then was quiet. He stood still and let the sound finish. This was what he knew better than any god knew any place. He had walked these ridges in every season. He knew where the ground became treacherous in spring, when the meltwater came down from the high slopes. He knew which caves held cold air in summer and which held warmth in winter. He knew the particular sound of the river laid on at different hours, quick and talkative in the morning, lower and slower by afternoon. Nearly silent in the full dark of night, when only the current itself made any sound at all. The cave he had in mind was not far. A low entrance set back beneath an overhang of limestone, the floor inside worn smooth from years of his sitting on it. No offerings there. No city below to send believers up the slope, only the sound of the hillside at whatever hour he arrived. He moved toward it without hurrying. The pine boughs above the path were still. He brushed one as he passed, and it released its resinous smell into the cool air, sharp and green and faintly bitter. He had always found that smell clarifying. It cut through whatever else was present. The wreath on his brow had been shedding all day. He put one hand up and touched it. More needles were loose than not. The small branches had dried out in the afternoon heat and were brittle at the joints. It would need replacing before long. There was a pine near the cave entrance that had good low branches. He would take a section from it when he arrived. He rounded the last bend in the path. The cave entrance was there, low and dark, set into the limestone face. A ledge of rock jutted out over it and kept rain from driving directly in. The floor just inside the entrance was clean. He had cleared it himself at some point, though he could not have said when exactly. He sat down just inside the opening, his back against the stone, and looked out at the hillside. The view from here was mostly pine trunks and the sky above them. A narrow slice of valley was visible through a gap in the trees. The silver thread of the laid-on was still faintly visible, though the light was fading fast now. He set the pipes across his knees, not to play, just to have them there. A goat appeared at the tree line below the cave. Then another behind it. They moved slowly across the open ground, heads down, cropping the dry grass with small, efficient movements. Their bells made a low, irregular sound that carried up the slope. He watched them without moving. This was the hour when the flock settled. The day's movement was done. The animals knew, by some calculation too old to name, when it was time to stop ranging and begin the slow process of finding ground for the night. He had watched this transition more times than he could count. It still held his attention. The goats moved further along the slope and disappeared into the lower pines. The sound of their bells faded and then was gone. Crickets had started somewhere to his left. A steady, low sound. He adjusted the pipes on his knees. The bone and reed were cool to the touch, smooth where his hands had worn them over years of handling. The sky above the pines was deepening. The last of the flat light was leaving the valley below. The stones around him held a little warmth still from the day. He could feel it through the back of his shoulders where they rested against the cave wall. He thought, briefly, of the lamp the old woman had left on the cave ledge in Athens. The small flame of it in the dark interior, her low voice asking about her son at sea. He had listened. That was all he could offer. Here, on this hillside, in this cave, he had returned to across more seasons than he could name. No one left lamps. No one asked for suns. The hillside made its own offerings without ceremony, the smell of pine resin, the bells of the settling flock, the particular cooling of the stone at dusk. He did not need to lean forward here to hear. The valley below was almost dark now. The line of willows along the laid-on was lost in shadow. The river was there but invisible, its sound too far away to reach the cave. He sat with the pipes across his knees and the pine wreath dry on his brow. A single needle fell from it and landed without sound on the stone beside his hoof. He looked at the needle for a moment, small and curved, brown at the tip where it had dried. Then he looked back out at the hillside. The dark was coming in properly now, not the sudden dark of cloud cover, but the slow, gradual kind that settled over Arcadia, like a hand pressing gently downward. The shapes of things remained a little longer than the colours did. The pine trunks stayed visible as vertical lines against the fading sky. The ground held its pale tone. Then those too began to soften. He had watched this transition from this cave many times. The particular way the Arcadian dart moved in from the valley first and worked upward toward the ridgeline. The high slopes were always the last to lose the light. He breezed in. The resin smell was fainter now. Cooler air carried it differently than warm air did. Still present, but quieter. The pipes rested across his knees. He did not touch them. His thoughts moved without urgency. That was something he had learned, or perhaps had simply always known, that thoughts, like the flocks on the hillside, found their own level when nothing pushed them. He thought of the mountain Tmolus, the slope where he had played, and the slope where Midas had stood listening with his foolish, honest ears. Pan had not been angry at Midas. He had understood. The man had simply heard what he heard. That was not a crime, whatever Apollo had decided. The ears of an ass were a very large response to a very small honesty, but then Apollo had always been that way. Precise and cold where precision and coldness served him. Pan had watched the god's face after the judgment and seen nothing in it except the flat satisfaction of someone confirming what they already believed. He had turned away from that face and looked out instead at the valley below, Tmolus, at the ordinary light on the ordinary hills, and felt nothing much at all. The pipes in his hands then had been the same as the pipes in his hands now, or nearly so. Reed wore down, bone cracked sometimes and had to be replaced. But they were the same instrument in every way that mattered. He shifted his weight slightly. The worn floor of the cave was comfortable in the particular way that familiar things are comfortable, not soft, but known. The stone shaped to his sitting the way a shepherd's staff shapes to the hand over years. Another needle fell from the wreath. He heard the faint scratch of it against his hair, and then it was gone. He thought of Syrinx. He did not do this often or deliberately. But the thought arrived sometimes when he was sitting still and the pipes were close and the air had that particular coolness. He thought of the marsh grass at the edge of the Ladon and the sound of the water, and the feeling of reaching out and finding something already changed into something else. There was no bitterness left in that memory. There had been once, a long time ago, but bitterness required a kind of insistence that he had let go somewhere across the long years. What remained was simpler. The reeds had made music. That was what had come from that reaching. Music and the pipes, and all the morning since when the sound of his own breathing through hollow reed had filled the Arcadian air with something that had not existed before. He was not sure that was compensation. He was not sure it needed to be. The cricket sound from the left had deepened, more than now, or the same one simply louder in the dark. He thought of Pitys. Her wreath was on his brow, such as it was, dry and shedding. He would cut fresh branches from the pine outside before the night was fully down. He did this without thinking about it each time, the same way he breathed or moved toward water when he was thirsty. The habit was old enough that it no longer felt like a gesture. It was simply part of how the day ended. That was, perhaps, how memory worked over a long enough time. The deliberate thing became the automatic thing. The grief became the gesture. The gesture became the ordinary rhythm of continuing. He did not find that diminishing. It seemed more like accuracy, more like the truth of how things lasted. The valley below was fully dark now. He could not see the Ladon at all. He knew it was there because he knew the valley, because he could place it in his mind the way he could place any feature of this landscape, not by seeing it, but by knowing it through seasons of walking. Marathon came to him briefly, the sound of it, the particular quality of that silence on the plain before the Persian forces broke. He had made that silence. He had felt it leave him the way breath leaves the body, outward and spreading. And he had watched from the high ground as the plain below went strange with a fear that had nothing to do with anything the men there could have named. They had run. The Persians. And then it was over. He had not stayed for the end of the battle. He had come down from the high ground and turned north and walked back through the hills. By the time he reached the pass above Arcadia, the plain behind him was quiet again. The Athenians had built him a cave. He had sat in it patiently while they came with oil lamps and honey and small-spoken prayers. He had listened to each one. The old woman's voice asking about her son was only one of many, though it was the one that came back to him most often. Perhaps because it had asked for so little, and that little had still been beyond what he could give, he let that thought settle. The hillside outside the cave was dark and still. The crickets continued. Somewhere further off, an owl called once, a low, hollow sound, brief and then absorbed back into the night. Pan sat with the pipes on his knees and the dry wreath on his brow. He was neither content nor restless. He was simply here, in the cave he had returned to more times than he could name, on the hillside he knew down to the individual stones on the path. All of it had happened. Olympus, and the laughter of the gods when his father carried him in, the marshes of the Ladon, the slope of Tmolus and Apollo's cold face, the plain at Marathon in the last dark before dawn. the cave on the Acropolis and its oil lamps and low voices. All of it had moved through him and around him and become, gradually, simply the long shape of what his life had been. He reached up and touched the wreath. The remaining needles were loose and dry. He set the pipes aside on the cave floor, stood, moved to the pine at the entrance without hurrying, found the branch he had noted on arrival, and broke it clean at the joint. The smell of fresh resin rose immediately, sharp and clear. He brought the branch back inside and sat again, worked the old wreath off his brow, set it down beside him, began to form the new one, bending the fresh pine into a slow circle in the dark, the resin cool and sticky on his fingers. Outside, the hillside held its silence. Far out on the Ionian Sea, on a night that Plutarch would later set down in careful words, a ship moved slowly through water that had gone unusually still. The pilot's name was Thamus. He was an Egyptian by birth, known to the passengers aboard for his steadiness and his long years on the water. He had made this crossing before. He knew the particular quality of the sea at that hour, the way sound carried across flat water, the way a voice seemed to have no distance in it when the wind had gone. He was not sleeping. He was watching the dark. And then a voice came across the water. It did not come from any direction he could name. It was not the wind, and it was not the sound of another vessel, and it was not the voice of any man aboard. It came from the water itself, or from the air above the water, or from somewhere between the two, in the way that sound sometimes travels at night when everything else is quiet. The voice said his name first, Thamus. Then it said what it had to say. Thamus, when you reach the shore at Palodes, announce that the great Pan is dead. He stood very still after that. The passengers who were awake on deck had heard it too. They looked at one another. No one spoke. The ship moved on through the silence, and the water did not move, and the sky overhead was thick with stars that gave light but no warmth. Thamus was not a man given to panic. He had been on the sea long enough to have heard strange things, to know the difference between a sound that had a natural explanation and a sound that did not. This was the second kind. He thought about it, the rest of the crossing. He turned it over the way a man turns a stone in his hand, checking each face of it. He considered not speaking when they reached the shore. A pilot might be forgiven for staying silent. A pilot might be excused from carrying messages whose nature he did not understand. But when they reached the shore at Palodes, and the wind fell off, and the water went calm again, and the moment came, Thamus stood at the prow and called the words out across the headland. The great Pan is dead. He said it clearly. He did not shout, but he spoke with the full weight of his breath behind it, and from the shore came a sound he had no word for. Not one voice but many, overlapping. Grief of some kind, or something that resembled grief. A sound that moved outward from the headland and then dissolved into the general quiet of the world. Then the sea returned to its ordinary sounds. The water against the hull, the rigging, the breathing of men, the world settling back into itself. Thamus would reach Rome eventually and tell this story to the Emperor Tiberius, who called scholars to hear it and deliberate over what it meant. They debated for a long time. Some said the Pan named was not the god of Arcadia, but a demon of the same name. Some said the announcement was allegorical, a figure of speech for the death of an old order. Some said it should be taken simply as reported and its meaning asked plainly. None of them had been on the water that night. None of them had heard the voice come from no direction and land in the chest like something thrown. In Arcadia, on the hillside above the Ladon Valley, on the night that may or may not have been the same night, the hillside was still. Pan sat in the cave with the new wreath finished and resting on his brow. The resin smell had already begun to shift from sharp to soft, the way cut pine did within the first hour. His fingers were still slightly sticky. He had not wiped them. The pipes lay on the cave floor beside him, dark and quiet. The crickets continued from the left, unhurried, filling the lower air with their even sound. He was not aware of the ship. He was not aware of Thamus standing at the prow of a vessel on calm water, or of the words being called out across a headland far to the south and east of him. He was sitting in his cave, in the dark, he knew, on the worn stone floor that had taken on the shape of long use. The owl did not call again. The pine tree at the cave entrance was a darkness within darkness, its outline just visible where it stood against a slightly lighter sky. He could feel the faint movement of air from the valley, cooler now, carrying the particular night smell of the hills below. He thought about nothing with great care. This was a skill he had developed over a long time, different from sleep, different from distraction. It was simply the practice of being where he was, without pulling the past forward or the future in. The cave, the dark, the resin, the crickets, the ladon somewhere below, running over its familiar stones. He touched the new wreath lightly, just the tips of his fingers against the pine needles. Still there, still green. The old wreath lay beside him on the stone floor, dry and circular, the shape of it still holding even without a head inside it. He did not put it outside. He did not throw it down the hillside. He left it where it lay, the way he always did. And in a few days the wind would take it, or the rain would soften it into the stone, or some small creature would pull it apart for nesting. That was the ordinary end of things. Not dramatic, simply the return of what had been cut back to what had grown it. He settled his back more firmly against the cave wall. The stone was cool and solid and known. The stone held the cold of the hill inside it, the way stone always did at this hour, deeper than air, steadier than anything that breathed. Pan did not move. The Homeric hymn that the poets would later sing about him described him this way, a joy to all the immortals. Not a fear, not a warning, a joy. The goat legs, the horns, the beard already full at birth, none of it had troubled the gods on Olympus. They had laughed and passed the infant between them and given him a name that meant everything, or all, or simply the whole of what was gathered there. The scholars in Rome, deliberating in Tiberius's court over the meaning of Thamus's account, had spent considerable energy on the question of which Pan had died. Their argument was practical. If a god could die, then something had changed in the nature of divinity itself. If the Pan named was only a demon, a lesser spirit of the same name, then the cosmic order remained intact, and the voice at sea was a footnote, not a rupture. They preferred the footnote, but the hymn had called him a joy to the immortals. Not a demon, not a local spirit. The child Hermes had wrapped in hareskins and carried up to Olympus, and the gods had stretched out their hands toward the strange infant and wanted him near. That was not the biography of something minor. Pan breathed out slowly. The cave breathed with him, or seemed to, the faint current of air moving from the entrance inward, then reversing, then settling again. The pine tree at the entrance held its shape in the dark. The needles made no sound. There was a version of the question that the scholars had not asked. Not which Pan had died, but what death could mean for a god whose nature was not a throne or a domain, but a condition of the world itself. Apollo held the sun. Poseidon held the sea. These were things that could, in some imagined rearrangement, be held differently. Another hand could carry them, but Pan was not holding wildness. He was wildness. He was the noon hour that stopped the breath of men walking in lonely places. He was the sound that reached across a hillside with no visible source. He was the sudden knowledge that one was very small in a very old landscape, and that the landscape did not require the presence of the person standing in it. That could not be transferred. It could only be present or absent. The crickets continued, left and steady, filling the lower air with their unhurried pulse. What the Arcadian hills knew, and what the scholars in Rome could not have known from their deliberations, was that the wild does not die in the way that kings die, or heroes die, or even nymphs die when they are transformed into trees and reeds and water. The wild recedes. It becomes quieter. It moves back from the roads as roads multiply, back from the fields as fields expand, back into the high places and the unmarked caves and the river edges where nothing has been planted. It does not vanish. It waits in the places where nothing has been done to the ground yet. Pan had always understood this. His cave above the Leiden was not the whole of Arcadia, but it was a piece of it that had not changed, the stone floor worn smooth by long sitting. The pine tree at the entrance seeding itself into the hillside below quietly, without needing to be instructed. The Leiden ran below, as it had run for as long as running water had existed in this part of the world. Syrinx had reached it ahead of him once, and her sisters had heard her prayer, and Pan had found only reeds where she had been. He had cut those reeds and shaped them and breathed through them, and the music that came was something he had not known was inside him until that moment. The pipes lay on the cave floor beside him now. Dark and quiet. He did not pick them up. The pine wreath on his brow had settled into his hair. The resin was barely there now, almost skin temperature, almost undetectable. In the morning it would be fully soft, and by afternoon the green would begin to fade from the needles, and within a few days they would dry to grey. Then a new one. Pitys had stood in the high forest, light-footed, moving through the pines as though she knew each one by name, which perhaps she did. Her transformation had given him this, not her presence, but the shape of her absence, which was the pine tree itself, and its particular smell, and the habit of wearing it close to his face, where he could find it without effort. That was not nothing. That was how the wild preserved things, not by keeping them as they were, but by converting them into something that stayed. The grief on the shore at Palodes had been real. Whatever voices had answered Thamus's words had not been performing mourning. The sound had moved outward and dissolved, the way grief does when it has been fully expressed, not suppressed, not prolonged, simply given to the air and released. The scholars called this inconclusive. The pilots called it unforgettable. Pan did not know about either of them. He sat in his cave, and the night moved around him unhurried. His fingers rested flat on the stone floor, still faintly sticky at the tips. The old wreath lay to his right, its circle intact. A dry thing, patient. The Homeric hymn would survive in the memory of the world long after the scholars who had debated his death were themselves gone. The hymn did not argue about his nature. It simply described what the gods had felt when Hermes carried him into Olympus, delight. The straightforward, uncomplicated delight of recognizing something that belonged. He had always belonged to Arcadia more than to Olympus, but belonging to a place and being loved in a place were not the same thing, and he had been, at various points, both. The cave was darker now than it had been an hour before, the way darkness sometimes deepened further in the hours well past midnight before the grey began. The crickets had not stopped. The Leiden moved below. Pan let his weight settle more fully against the cave wall, shoulder and back, and the side of his head finding the stone. Not sleep exactly. The thing he did at the deepest hour that was not quite sleep, not quite waking, the practice of presence without effort, the hillside above him, the hillside below, the cave containing both. His name meant all or everything, and in the dark above the Leiden valley, on a night when the sea somewhere far to the south had carried a strange voice to a pilot's ears, the word did not feel like too much. It felt like this: the cave, the pine, the river, the slow breath moving through the dark. The shepherd had been on the hillside since before the last light left the sky. He was not young, not old. A man who had spent enough seasons on that particular slope to know the sounds it made at each hour, the goats settling, the river finding its lower register, the crickets taking up their position in the dark. He knew all of those sounds. What he heard now was something else. It came from the direction of the river Leiden, from the place where the reeds grew thick along the bank, where the water slowed before it turned. Not wind exactly, though it moved the way wind moves, without intention, without destination. Not quite music, though it had the quality of music, a breath across hollow reeds, a single tone that rose and settled before it could be named. He stood still. The goats around him did not stir. The sound did not repeat. It became silence, and the silence had a particular quality, the way a room is different after a bell has rung in it, not empty. Residual. He looked toward the cave above him, the dark opening in the hillside above the ladon where the single pine stood at the entrance. Its shape barely visible against the deeper dark of the stone. Nothing moved there. The pine tree held its needles without sound. He waited. He was a man accustomed to waiting on hillsides. Nothing came. After a time he sat down on the ground among his goats, and the crickets continued their steady pulse in the lower air, and the ladon moved below in the dark. And the night was exactly as it had been before, except that it was not. Inside the cave above, the stone floor held the cold of deep hours. A smell of resin and dust and something older. The pine tree at the entrance cast no shadow because there was nothing to cast it against, only dark meeting dark, and the outline of branches that could be felt more than seen. The pipes lay on the floor. They did not move. They were old instruments cut from the reeds of the ladon itself, shaped by hands that had learned their own grief in the shaping. Hollow, patient. The kind of object that holds a memory not in any visible mark, but in the simple fact of its form, in the reason it was made, the way it was made, and the moment it was made in. And what had stood in the river just before? The reeds along the bank still grew where Syrinx had stood. Her sisters had answered her prayer in the last moment, and what Pan had reached for had been marsh and hollow grass and the sound of water. He had not been angry. He had not been resigned. He had simply stood in the river with his hands full of reeds and felt the loss of her as a physical thing, precise and total, and then he had begun to cut. That was the wild's way of keeping things, not intact, but converted. Not preserved, but present in a different form. The pine wreath had dried further in the night hours. The needles would be fully grey in a day or two. Pity's was in every pine that stood on the Arcadian hillsides, in the resin that came off on fingers that touched bark without thinking. In the particular smell of a hillside after rain, when the trees released what they had stored. She had not been lost. She had been redistributed. This was not consolation exactly, but it was true, and truth in the wild had a weight that consolation did not. The old wreath lay to his right on the cave floor, its circle still intact, dry and patient. A new one would come when it came. The pine at the entrance was already providing for it, needles and small branches within reach of a hand that knew how to gather without disturbing. The ladon ran below, a sound so continuous it had become part of the structure of the valley, part of the way the air was arranged here, indistinguishable from the ground itself. Somewhere on the sea a pilot had steadied his hands on a tiller and let the words go out across the water. And whatever answered had answered, and the grief had been expressed and released, and the sea had gone on being the sea. Arcadia had not felt it as a rupture. Arcadia had felt it as a breath, the kind that comes after a long effort, the kind that means the effort is complete. The cave was at its deepest now. Not full dark, which comes earlier, but the particular dark of the hour before grey begins to separate from black. When the night concentrates itself, as though drawing in before it lets go. The crickets continued, left and steady. A sound with its own history by now, its own place in the long catalogue of things that had not changed in this hollow above the ladon. The shepherd on the hillside had stopped waiting. He sat with his back against a stone, and his goats arranged around him, and he did not know what he had heard, and he found he did not need to know. It had been a sound from the reeds. It had been one breath moving through hollow grass at the water's edge. It had been the valley doing what the valley did, without explanation, without witness required. The pine tree at the cave entrance dropped a single needle. It fell without sound to the ground below and was absorbed into the dark. The reeds along the ladon bent once, slightly, without wind. They stilled,